I have been for some time a, a party interested in what is called um, the aesthetics of America, and in contrast to or looking beyond America in Europe and Asia, other places. Essentially, what is actually an American thing has always been something unique. And as I watched debates last night and thought about how much we have concentrated our wealth in the last 20 years, during this whole period of time, what we call the Master Settlement Agreement, I'm almost convinced that I can make a connection between all of the windfall profit that came from that particular time in the 1997 and 98 agreements, and the totally corrupt means by which we put ourselves in the hands of other people and trust them. And maybe we don't really trust them anymore. In watching the political debates, I am reminded that during the time before I was involved in the tobacco madness, there was a different kind of America for me, because I had no idea and never really had a respect for or any kind of interest in stock market or the business of being an American businessman. But I certainly had a pride in what was our intellectual capacity and our creative ability. And in the sense of the words that are being tossed around today, the writers, the people, particularly Ayn Rand or Ayn Rand, and the focus of greed and the focus of what actually came out of that tobacco settlement in 1998. It's almost as if you have a corruption that is so lasting, it turned into, or it was cycled into, the various things that happen due to a lot of greed that came in the 90s and was around in the 80s, certainly in the sense of the politics of Ronald Reagan, the Savings and Loan Institution failures in the late 80s. And we've always had this, but the catalyst of all this has been somewhat on the side of where are we in terms of our relationship to aesthetics, to art, to things that we were bound to appreciate. We were formed in that mold to appreciate because of our European heritage. In the main, the European heritage, the English, the European. I think I wouldn't eliminate, any kind of relationship with a South American culture, but basically you can't deny that we developed an aesthetic, and in our colleges and universities. When I was matriculating through all of the things that I recognize certainly the literary aspects of it, and the concept of what we can do as a nation, what we do as a nation. And it's pathetic now what we have come into in the form of our own individual failures. It seems to be most focused in the area of comedic wandering of some sort. In any case, the thing that we miss now, or I miss now, and I think that some people might agree with me here, is that, you know, every generation develops a moral and a moral depravity, and the two come together somehow in a different way than the generations before. And I think that tobacco products have made and defined for us so many different aesthetic differences and appeals that it's hard not to notice to some extent how that kind of wealth and that kind of consumption in the late 90s didn't lead directly to the cataclysmic misfortunes of not only the housing market, stock market before that, and the greed, the constant impeccable greed, and watching the politics of today and seeing the figures that they're putting on these. I mean, I about a year ago predicted wrongly that this would probably be $1 billion per candidate, corrupt, but nevertheless paid for election, and it turned out to be far bigger than that. And that was a little piece on Comedy Central, and certainly made point. $6 billion. I mean, we can live off of this. We could have elections all the time. But in terms of our aesthetics and dealing with the tobacco settlement, it is totally morally depraved. It is morally bankrupt. It is totally without any sense of dignity to have a man who forwards $2.5 million and gets $27 million for a year for the next 25 years. And he's already spent 12 years of it. These were the things that I think brought about this consummate pain that is America right now. I mean, they were talking last night in the debates about the middle class, $250,000 being the part where you join the poverty level or something to that extent, and then there's the middle class, but never the poverty. The poverty is there. And the poverty is where the targeting is for tobacco. It always will be, because that's just the way they aim their targets. I mean, it's like people will depend on saying what's for children, and I'm convinced absolutely that it has never been, except for those who could hardly afford it, and could hardly afford the death that came and the pain and the angst that came through that later on. I am convinced that we are this generation, and probably since the change in the climate of the lawyers setting a precedent for America, and the health community being a part of it, and the states certainly trying to make the most of it and will continue to do so for the next 12 years. That all of this is centralized on the greed of that particular settlement. Now, I could be completely wrong because what happens with the financial sectors is certainly part and the biggest part of this. But greed itself on Wall Street and greed in terms of, well, just derivatives and the idea of dealing with finances, that in itself grew out of the lack of a responsible type of leadership. And I'm sorry, but the Glass-Steagall Act was appealed by Bill Clinton, and the thoughts that came around due to the foreclosures were, I mean, the backing came from good intentions, but a lot of greedy people. Now today we have billionaires, not millionaires. I mean, Dick Scruggs looks like peanuts compared to what you have out there in these industries that are ripping off another generation and creating another generation of morality. I mean, and essentially it's an old thing. Everything seems to be pretty much on the Ponzi side or whatever. But my point is that it probably all comes from this tobacco settlement. At least the gist of it, the lust for the money part of it. And there are certainly people who are wealthy, but to spend $6 billion on an election campaign, that is not American. That's not what we were about. But the point of the aesthetics that we would represent in terms of our life, not only a tangible gift that we have brought about as a result of our European and various Asian or European, Asian, our essentially our English background. We came together and put something into generations, and I know we're missing now a lot of this because of greed and because of a moral depravity that exists and has nothing to do with anything but a higher form of greed. Now, as to tobacco itself as the mastermind behind this, I think they knew that all of the people involved in this master settlement would be greedy, and therefore they could win. They have. It's appalling, but nevertheless, I think back on what are you doing to our artistic community and our heritage of aesthetics and values in terms of the performing arts and the great tradition of American literature and there's certainly a lot to be said for the greatness that is presently here, but there's something missing, and this whole idea of having stars as politicians and having this intangible way of dealing with what we don't have anymore. It really bothers me, and it probably comes from that settlement. In any case, I look back years ago. I remember going to the Hollywood Bowl, and it was interesting to think how tobacco had changed something later on, because I was fortunate enough to be in the city at the time that Aaron Copland was celebrating his 70th birthday, and he was having his presentation of It was a marvelous thing to see, sitting on the concrete and listening to Aaron Copland present his life's work, so to speak. And he was 70, and it was interesting. He'd been brought up approximately in a time when the focus was, there were tycoons and there was an enormous creative spirit at the turn of the century, and I was obviously born practically, I would think, around 1900. And what was so intriguing about this to me was he was a true American composer, and he didn't smoke. He didn't get, I assume he didn't get around a lot of that pollution that comes from smoke and the use of that product. But his, it was always interesting to me, and I always watch when I see a famous person who has made something out of the United States, out of the country, out of the life as an artist, and to see the artist live as long as they can. Clint Eastwood, a good example, has lived obviously a healthy life, and he hasn't been. He's not a. They haven't made of him what could have happened to, say, River Phoenix, a great potential there of becoming somebody, a long-lasting career in the arts. And that was a totally different kind of situation, but it has a totally different sort of moral depravity in that, and I think the innocence of that kind in that generation. But with Aaron Copland, you had a man standing on this, leading the symphony, which was playing his own music, that is probably the only that I can recall, the only classical American music that's ever been totally American, or classical music as it is. The interesting part about that to me is comparing that 70 years and that mark in his life, and he lived to be another 20 years thereafter, and he made another impression on someone who was younger than he, and that was the Leonard Bernstein. And Leonard Bernstein, although he was probably a little more in the line of a follower, certainly was in the same tradition of the great Aaron Copland. And when you think about what tobacco does to artists and to the aesthetics of our lives, you have to somehow feel a bit of compassion for the fact that it's a brutal concept that we have endorsed, and we could have actually done something. And maybe 100 years from now, as I think about my own children and their children, and the children that will come from them, when I think about that, I wonder, will you ever do it? Will you ever have the opportunity again? Because you squandered this. You have squandered it completely. And when you think back and you wonder, what did Aaron Copland, who is the American classical composer, and you don't come across those that often, and he had a follower, and that was Leonard Bernstein. And Leonard Bernstein, on the other side of this, had a career much shorter. And the career was in his early 60s. And the reason that he never went beyond that, and remember, he was totally American in so many ways in presenting the many wonderful pieces of music, sometimes in the classical vein. I know he contributed to a number of pieces, and he did, for the most part, people remember him for West Side Story, perhaps mostly, but I know many others. Johnny Johnson, the contributions he made to people, and he mentored others, but his whole life was following in his footsteps of Aaron Copland, who lived to be 90. So there's 70 and 90, and then there's a man who dies because he smokes. And not only does he smoke, he just cannot live without the constant pain of the lung disease that he's developed through the single source, tobacco use. Now, what happens in young artists, very often, is that they are used by the tobacco company, less so now than before. So the point that I think is important to recall is when you see how long the impression was built by Aaron Copland, and the same vein, you had the same, less of a longevity in terms of creating something for us. And that was in Leonard Bernstein's life. He died early, and what would he have given if he had continued? And would have given a longer career. And you often see this, and this happens. And it's not just because of a society that we have produced. And certainly I go back to, I only define tobacco in terms of its productive years. And its productive years were after World War I, and we could have stopped, certainly, we could have done something if only we hadn't been so involved with greed. And the greed was the basic concept behind the whole thing that the tobacco companies knew about. They knew the states would do it. They knew the health people would do it. They knew that the lawyers would do it, of course. So let's not be deceived by this again. 100 years from now, maybe you'll have another opportunity. I don't know. I doubt it. But there's going to be smarter people, hopefully. And when we're out there being greedy, and this probably all begins, the heart and soul of it is when you're just throwing, you're throwing the money and after great careers, and you're destroying them early. The comparison between the wonderful and delightful experience of seeing Aaron Copland when he was 70, conducting the orchestra in his own compositions on that one night at the Hollywood Bowl. It's quite an experience. You would never see, because the younger genius, the younger person, who had composed and created so much for the New York Philharmonic and for many shows and pieces of which were classic in their own right, and you would not see that in Aaron in Leonard Bernstein, because He was to die very young. What would you have got? I always ask this question. If the artist was not killed by tobacco, and I do mean that. Every time I say it, I mean it. Killed by tobacco. There's no mincing of words here. And, when you get people out there in the health community and they're just, they're wondering, well, why is Russia having such a hard time with tobacco use? It's just idiotic. You have your own country to worry about. And you're out there, Mr. Bloomberg and Mr. Myers, and you're out there making these statements about Russia for all. I mean, Russia had some wonderful, wonderful artists, certainly, and they still do, of course. But there's no question about it. Your work is here, and if you're closer to home, maybe you'll do the job, rather than traveling around and making the observations that, yes, tobacco's a killer, but it's a killer here because you simply have weighed in very politely and let them off. God forbid that should happen again, but it will. You're going to go with this master settlement, and it's going to go on another 12 years as it is. And you will collect your money, and the states will collect their money, and the lawyers who, have felt this is a windfall, but unfortunately it's not as big as it should, because you have comparatively very little money by the common standards of Wall Street and the hoods and the hoodlums and the hooligans and the people who are doing this to this country. $6 billion for a political election? Try to explain that to Brazil and Colombia. Just try to explain how this is used. They don't understand, and I don't understand. I understand what greed is, and I understand why Aaron Copland managed to live so long, to continue his life and create an impression, and why his follower, who would have been as great, perhaps, died in his early 60s because he was totally obsessed with the use of tobacco, and he died because of tobacco-related disease. There's no hope, no real understanding other than the kind of malaise and misinformation, and it's sort of like watching a talented young person who's stupid because he doesn't understand. And that's the target market of tobacco users. Exactly that. It's the River Phoenix type. The syndrome that killed a young actor, and perhaps a great actor, I don't know, but he's just one example. Did the same thing to the follower of Aaron Copland, who could have been a much more profound and influential composer and director. So it's disappointing, but it's all about greed, it's all about money, and it's all about power and being respectable in a world where you really don't deserve it. So again, back to the master settlement and back to the late 1990s and how this turned around on perhaps that one occasion right there. Maybe it wasn't the only reason, but it was certainly one reason. And we look at things now in a different way. Our appetites are far too big, and they're far too select. A few people, just a few, winning out, and we have a $6 billion competitive race to lead us to another time and another totally moral the disability and our greed and what we do with what we have. And that's sad. And I certainly regret having anything to do with it. Fortunately, I did. And so it goes on. Maybe 100 years it'll change. I wouldn't count on it, though.